My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 31 years old, and I work as an executive chef specializing in farm-to-table cuisine. The man who was supposed to become my father-in-law slammed a heavy manila envelope and an elegant mahogany box onto the table. He looked at me, completely cold, and said, "A cashier's check for $500,000, plus the deed to a turnkey restaurant in a prime spot in the Boston seaport. Sign this non-disclosure agreement and disappear completely. A woman from your background has no business marrying into the Vance bloodline. You are nothing but middle-class noise. You will only bring shame to my son and ruin everything we have spent generations building." I didn't touch the money, and I didn't even look at the deed. I just stood up and walked straight out the door. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a commercial real estate office in the Back Bay, signing a short-term lease for a modest corner bakery. This was actually just a normal item on my to-do list for that Tuesday afternoon. But what I didn't know was that Richard Vance had hired a private investigator to follow me. The detective took photos of me leaving that building with my folder of paperwork. He then cleverly doctored a report to make it look like I had just accepted the bribe and couldn't wait to cash in on the luxury real estate. The next morning, those photos and a short note ended up on Julian's desk. The note simply read, "She took it." Julian looked at the pictures and suddenly burst out laughing. He called my phone and said softly, "Sarah, since my father thinks he just bought the outcome he wanted, let's give him exactly what he paid for. Let's play along." It was that one simple sentence that set the trap, causing the people who thought they controlled everything to light the fuse on their own empire. If you are already hooked and angry on my behalf, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment with your city and the exact time you are watching this video because I read every single one. And if you want to hear how this story completely blows up in a massive explosive twist at the very end, make sure to subscribe. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this finishes. I met Julian Vance back in October of 2024 at a high-end charity gala in Boston. I was catering the event, showing off a sustainable menu sourced entirely from local farms. He stopped right in front of my station. Most of the wealthy, high-society people who stopped by that night were just looking for cheap labor, or they wanted to steal a few trendy, eco-friendly buzzwords to make themselves look good. But Julian asked real, substantive questions. He wanted to know how these farms managed their soil crop rotations. He asked how the storage costs for root vegetables during the long, brutal Massachusetts winters compared to a traditional supply chain. We grabbed a coffee. That coffee turned into dinner at an old-school Italian joint in the North End, and that dinner turned into an 18-month relationship. I truly believed what we were building was unbreakable. He worked at his family's company, Vance Pharmaceuticals. It was a 3-generation biomedical giant, the kind of massive corporation that quietly buys up endless patents until the price of a life-saving drug suddenly skyrockets, and people finally start paying attention. Julian was the chief medical officer. After graduating from medical school, he didn't just jump straight into the executive suite. He actually worked on the front lines of clinical care for a few years. He climbed the ladder step by step because when your last name is printed on the outside of the building, you always feel like you have something to prove. I loved that he actually cared about the quality of life for patients after they received treatment. Most pharmaceutical executives only care about how much the stock jumps on the day a new drug hits the market. Julian wanted to know if these medications actually relieved the financial burden on families. He wanted to know if they truly extended a life with dignity, rather than just serving as an expensive product to keep a heart beating. We were completely different in so many ways, but we complemented each other perfectly. He came from one of the oldest, wealthiest neighborhoods in Boston, with money that had been in his family for 3 generations. I came from a dairy farming family in upstate New York. My dad was an orchardist with heavily calloused hands, and my mom was a sharp farm accountant who watched every penny. They raised me to believe that you reap what you sow, that cutting corners just makes the barn collapse, and that a single mistake on the books can make you lose control of your life. Julian went to expensive private boarding schools and Ivy League universities. I worked my way through a state college by washing dishes in restaurants, earning a dual degree in culinary arts and business management. I had only paid off my student loans 2 years ago, and I was still driving my 2016 Toyota Corolla. But we shared the exact same core belief. Food, just like medicine, exists to help people live better lives. And if you are going to commit yourself to either of those fields, you had better have a deep respect for real living people. In the fall of 2025, during a weekend trip to the Berkshires when the maple leaves had turned a deep fiery red, he proposed to me. He gave me his late grandmother's ring, an emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds, set in a platinum band. His grandmother, Elizabeth, had passed away from heart disease 10 years earlier. Julian rarely talked about his massive, cold family. The only person he truly missed was his grandmother because she was the only adult in the family who ever asked him, "Who do you want to be?" Instead of ordering him, "This is who you should be." Before he could even finish his proposal speech, I told him yes. At our engagement dinner, my dad gripped Julian's hand tightly and said, "You are taking away the best person I know." Julian looked my father right in the eye and said very seriously, "I know, sir. I know exactly how lucky I am." My dad, whose hands were rough from 40 years of hard labor on the farm, smiled with pure relief. My mom was so emotional, she just kept wiping away tears. My younger brother, who was still studying agriculture in college, joked that someone was finally taking this tyrant chef off his hands. It was one of those nights where you could genuinely feel that this is exactly what a family is supposed to look like. Richard Vance did not attend. The official excuse was that he was in Europe inspecting laboratories. 2 weeks later, he had his secretary send over a card. It just had the word "Congratulations" printed on it in a cold, sterile font. There was no handwritten signature, no mention of wanting to meet me, and none of the usual polite phrases welcoming me to the family. It was just a machine-printed card with his name stamped at the bottom. Julian explained that this was just how his father was. He was old-fashioned, detached, and uncomfortable with expressing emotion. I said it was fine, that we would meet eventually, and that we had plenty of time. I should have known right then. A man who chooses to be absent during a moment of joy isn't just being cold. He is declaring his control. I had spent 5 years working as the executive sous chef at a famous upscale restaurant in Boston's historic Innovation District. When I started, my salary was only $45,000 a year. I spent every single day in a hot, suffocating kitchen handling hundreds of ingredients. That was where I learned how to read between the lines with picky diners. When they said they wanted a traditional flavor, they actually just wanted a plate that looked expensive. When they said, "Just surprise me," it usually meant their budget was incredibly tight. I learned to observe people's unspoken desires and how they actually lived, rather than just the image they wanted to project. By 2025, I had become the executive chef with my own independent menu. I was making $85,000 a year, managing a team of 30 people, and I had won 2 Rising Star Awards in the culinary world. Every single dish I made could stand up to the toughest scrutiny. My boss, a strict old-school French chef, once told me, "Sarah, you have a rare gift. You see the people eating the food, not just the ingredients. That is why the guests trust you." I built my entire career on that trust, dish by dish, guest by guest. I wasn't making the astronomical numbers that the Vance family made, but I was doing work I truly believed in, and I was living a respectable life. But what I didn't know was that Richard Vance had already hired someone to run a massive background check on me. My salary, the tax returns from my parents' farm, my student loan repayment history, my credit score. He gathered every single piece of data he thought he could use to calculate my exact financial value. The headquarters of Vance Pharmaceuticals took up the top 4 floors of the most expensive glass skyscraper in Cambridge. The main lobby featured portraits of 3 generations of leaders. There was the grandfather, who built the company's fortune after World War II by developing affordable antibiotics. There was the uncle, who took the company public in the 80s. And then there was Richard, who took over in 2000 and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar global giant. In every single photo, the men were smiling, except for Richard. In his portrait, Richard looked like a cold accountant who was in the middle of counting up his assets. Julian's office was at the very end of the hall from Richard's. It was a bit smaller, and didn't have those massive floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows overlooking the Charles River. He once told me, "My grandfather made medicine to save lives. My father makes medicine to create profit myths for Wall Street. I want to find a balance between the two." Hearing that kind of awareness made me love him even more. But in all of our conversations about the future, Richard was always an unavoidable shadow hanging over us, and I was about to find out that to Richard, absolute control was far more important than his son's happiness, or even the continuation of the family itself. On a Monday evening in December, my phone rang. I was in the back of the kitchen, checking over the supplier list for next month's fresh ingredients. Richard Vance's name popped up on the screen. This was the first time he had ever called me directly. I picked up and said, "Hello, Mr. Vance." His voice was completely businesslike, exactly like someone talking to a raw materials supplier. "I want to speak with you privately about a few matters. Do you have some time tomorrow at noon? Just the two of us." Just the two of us. That phrase brought with it a heavy, uncomfortable feeling of pure pressure. "Tomorrow?" I repeated. "Yes, the Brookline Country Club, 12:30. I've booked a private dining room under my name." He paused for a beat. "It's best we keep this low-key." Low-key. The word just hung there in the air, sounding like a threat wrapped in a polite invitation. I could have said no. I could have asked him what this was actually about, or called Julian right then and there. But I didn't. I just said, "I'll be there." Deep down, I wanted to hear exactly how ugly he was willing to get when he finally said what he was thinking out loud. That night, back at our rented apartment in Beacon Hill, I tried to bring it up casually while Julian and I were making dinner. I was making beef bourguignon from scratch, and that cozy, ordinary Tuesday night routine felt like solid proof that we were building a real life together. "Your dad called me today," I said, stirring the pot. "He asked me to grab lunch with him tomorrow." Julian stopped slicing the baguette and looked up at me. "My dad called you directly? Did he say what it was about?" "Just that he wanted to talk privately." Julian's whole expression shifted. First came surprise, and then this little glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. "That's actually a really good sign. Maybe he's finally coming around. You know, he probably just wants to get to know you better or talk about the wedding plans." I nodded along, keeping the screaming warning signs in my gut entirely to myself. "Text me when it's over," Julian said. "I want to know how it goes." I promised him I would. But lying in bed that night, I had this heavy intuition that something bad was coming, though I never could have guessed just how transactionally naked he was going to make it. The next morning I picked out my outfit very carefully. I went with a dark gray professional pantsuit my mom bought me 2 years ago to celebrate my promotion, and paired it with simple pearl studs. I wanted to look professional, but absolutely not submissive or eager to please. Julian kissed me before he headed out the door, still full of optimism. "Good luck. I really think this is his way of trying to accept us." I drove my old Corolla through the freezing December wind and pulled up to the Brookline Country Club at exactly 12:28. The receptionist gave me a polished, professional smile, but when I gave her the name for the reservation, Vance, her smile stayed put while her eyes immediately shifted. It was that classic look of upper-class judgment, the kind of instinctive reaction regular people have when real power and money walk through the door. "Right this way, please." She led me through the luxurious lobby toward a private room tucked away in the very back. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the windows and hiding us from any witnesses. Richard was already seated. He didn't even stand up when I walked in. "Thanks for coming, Sarah." His tone was freezing and completely clinical, like he was thanking an employee about to be laid off for showing up to their exit interview on time. I took a seat. "Mr. Vance, I have to admit I'm curious about why you asked to meet today." He smiled, but it was completely empty. It didn't reach his eyes at all. Let's just call it establishing expectations. There were no menus on the table. Right next to his chair sat a heavy manila envelope and a mahogany box. He had a glass of neat single malt whiskey already poured in front of him, but he hadn't ordered anything for me. "We won't be ordering food," he said. "This won't take up much of your time." With that, he slid the envelope and the box across the table toward me. The envelope wasn't sealed, and inside was a cashier's check from Bank of America for $500,000. Inside the box was a heavy official deed, $500,000 in cash, plus the title to a ready-to-go luxury restaurant in the Boston seaport. Combined, that was enough value to save a regular chef 30 years of grueling hard work. $500,000 in cash plus the seaport property, Richard said. It wasn't an offer, he was just stating a fact. It's tax-free. If you prefer, the funds can be wired directly to any offshore account of your choosing. Then he slid another document toward me. It was 12 pages long, bearing the letterhead of a top-tier law firm, with sticky notes pointing out exactly where I needed to sign. It was an incredibly strict non-disclosure agreement. You will cut off all contact with Julian. You will not speak to anyone about this family, and you will not attempt to have any future association with the Vance name. You need to leave Boston. Ideally, you'll move to the West Coast. He placed a Mont Blanc pen right on top of the paperwork. The final page was even pre-stamped with a notary seal. I've already used my network to secure excellent executive chef positions for you in Seattle, San Francisco, and Portland. With your skills, you'll do very well. I looked down at the cashier's check, and then I looked back up at him. Why? It's nothing personal, Sarah. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. It's just business reality. I am currently in the middle of negotiating a $400 million Series C funding merger with Sterling Capital Group. This deal will decide whether Vance Pharmaceuticals survives or goes under over the next 20 years. Arthur Sterling controls some of the highest political and capital resources in Washington and on Wall Street, and he values a certain kind of security. A family alliance, to be exact. He said it with this total sense of entitlement, like I was supposed to be intimidated by it. Arthur has a daughter named Eleanor. She's 29, a Stanford Law graduate, and her resume is flawless. She and Julian are a perfect match, both personally and for the future of our business. Your presence is blocking that alliance. He pointed a finger at the check and the deed on the table. I admit you're a talented chef, but you come from a working-class farming family that only knows how to dig in the dirt. Your career is just high-end hospitality. Your family— He paused, clearly picking the sharpest words he could find. Your family brings absolutely zero leverage to the table for Vance Pharmaceuticals. That sentence hit me like a slap to the face. It wasn't that we weren't a good fit, or that our personalities clashed. It was that we brought zero leverage. These assets are worth more than you would make standing on your feet in a kitchen for 20 years, Richard continued. As compensation for buying out the last 18 months of your youth, this is more than fair. Sign the NDA, tell Julian that the pressure is too much and the relationship isn't working, and move away within 60 days. He even handed me a printed piece of paper. It was a literal script, mapping out word for word exactly how I was supposed to break up with his son. I've realized we want different things out of life. Your family's expectations are suffocating me. I need to focus on my own career. Word for word, it was like I was some cheap actress he had hired to destroy his son's heart on cue. The deal with Sterling Capital has to be finalized by March 15th, Richard said. This matter needs to be resolved before then, cleanly, efficiently, and without any dramatic scenes. He had clearly been planning this for weeks, maybe even months. While Julian and I were happily planning our wedding, picking out flowers and debating the guest list, Richard Vance was methodically figuring out how to erase me. I stood up. No. Richard blinked, looking like he hadn't heard me right. Sarah, be rational. This amount of wealth is far more than— No. I turned toward the door of the private room. You are making a massive mistake, he said, his voice finally losing its smooth edge. It was the very first crack in that fake, professional mask he always wore. I stopped and looked back at him. Your mistake is thinking I have a price tag. I pushed the door open and walked out, letting it slam shut behind me. The freezing December Boston air hit my face, making me feel incredibly alive, standing on my own 2 feet, entirely myself. I hadn't touched a single cent of that money, not even a single piece of paper. I rejected him because of my principles, not just my pride. There's a big difference between the two. But I had no idea what was coming next. I didn't know just how extreme Richard would get when someone actually told him no. I started walking aimlessly. The freezing wind cut right through my coat as I walked through the Boston Common. I watched families feeding ducks by the pond, saw young parents pushing strollers, and looked at all these beautifully ordinary real lives. Then my phone buzzed. It was Julian. How was lunch? I just stared at the screen. How do you text someone, your dad just tried to force me out of your life with $500,000 and a restaurant? How do you type that out without sounding completely insane? I texted back, it was a lot. Let's talk when you get home tonight. The 3 little typing dots popped up instantly. Was it weird? Is everything okay? What did he want to talk about? We'll talk details when you get home. It's okay. Love you. Love you too. I sat in that freezing wind for over an hour, watching total strangers live their normal lives, while my own life had just been appraised, priced, and given a death sentence. I was so cold my bones literally ached, but I didn't move. I tried to process, file away, and memorize every single word and detail Richard had said. Deep down, some instinct told me I was going to need those memories later. By 2:30, I checked my phone and remembered I still had an important piece of business to take care of. It was for an empty corner property in the Back Bay I'd been eyeing the week before. I was planning to take it over and turn it into a little neighborhood bakery that specialized in whole wheat sourdough and artisanal jams. Today was the absolute deadline to sign the short-term lease. The commercial real estate office was only 3 blocks away. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and walked over there slowly, trying to force my life back into its normal routine. The office was quiet. I sat in the reception area for a few minutes before being called into the manager's office. "Sarah, you made it. The paperwork is all set," the agent said with a smile, handing over the documents. I carefully checked the numbers. It was $4,500 a month. I paid the deposit and signed my name. The deal was done by 3:10, and he handed me a copy of the lease in a brown manila envelope. I walked out of the real estate office holding that envelope, my mind completely consumed by what I should make for dinner and how on earth I was going to tell Julian what his father had done. I was actively trying to avoid the reality that my entire future had just been reduced to a bargaining chip inside a paper bag. I didn't look back, so I never noticed the man sitting in the coffee shop across the street with a camera. His telephoto lens was pointed straight at the real estate office doors, capturing every single second of me walking out with that manila envelope. I had no clue Richard Vance had hired this guy 2 weeks ago. Originally, it wasn't to stalk me, he wanted to dig up dirt on my past. But when he found absolutely nothing, and I walked out of the country club empty-handed after refusing to sign, Richard sent a single text message: "Manufacture the evidence." And Kenneth Garrett, a private investigator, executed that order perfectly. I took the T back to Beacon Hill and climbed up to our 3rd-floor apartment with the exposed brick walls. That was the kitchen where we learned how to cook as a team, where we had our very first fight over whether to get a golden retriever, and where we called our families to tell them we were engaged. I tossed my bag onto the counter and tried to force myself to look at the restaurant scheduling sheets for a bit, but I couldn't focus at all. I started mindlessly chopping vegetables, using the rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board to try and digest everything that had happened that afternoon. Julian got home at 6:10, a bit earlier than usual. He found me standing by the stove, holding a wooden spoon and staring blankly into an empty pot. "Hey," he said, walking over to kiss my hair. "What happened with lunch?" I turned off the burner and looked straight at him. "Your father offered me a $500,000 cashier's check and the deed to a restaurant in the seaport to sign an NDA and walk away from you forever." Julian completely froze, his keys still hanging from his hand. What? A cashier's check in a manila envelope, the deed, and he even gave me a literal script telling me exactly how to break up with you, along with a list of West Coast cities he suggested I move to. My voice was eerily quiet, like I was stating some basic scientific fact. He told me I was just middle-class noise, that I would bring shame to you, and that I'd ruin everything the Vance family has built. Julian set his keys onto the dining table very slowly, pulled out a chair and sat down. "Sarah, tell me every single detail." So I told him everything. The private dining room, the check, the NDA, the breakup script, and how he brought up Eleanor from Sterling Capital for that corporate alliance. He had calculated the exact price of erasing me from the equation. "I told him no," I said, looking into his eyes. "I didn't touch the money, I just walked out of the room." Julian was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Why didn't he just come talk to me directly?" "Because he knew you would say no. He wanted the problem to solve itself. You aren't a problem, Sarah. You're the person I chose to spend the rest of my life with." His voice was incredibly tight, holding back a deep, boiling rage. "He actually went behind my back and tried to pay you off like you were some kind of—" He couldn't even bring himself to finish the sentence. We just sat there at the kitchen table as the night grew darker, letting the freezing reality sink in. Richard Vance had tried to buy me out of his son's life. I had refused, and neither of us had any idea what was going to happen next. We talked for hours that night about control, about money, and about what a family even means when someone thinks they can put a price tag on everything. We debated whether to go confront Richard right away or just wait, and what this whole messy transaction meant for us, our future, and our wedding next fall. "I want to marry you," Julian said finally. "It doesn't matter what my father thinks or what he does. That is never going to change." "I know," I said. "Same here." What we didn't know while we were having that heart-to-heart was that Kenneth, the private investigator, was pulling an all-nighter at his office in South Boston. He was uploading the photos of me outside the real estate office and typing up a fake report that twisted my normal Tuesday lease signing into proof of a total betrayal. He was fabricating the exact story Richard paid him to create, and in less than 14 hours, everything was going to blow up. When I fell asleep that night, I was naive enough to think the worst was behind us. I thought I had stood up to Richard Vance's pressure, kept my dignity, and that we could get through this together. I had absolutely no idea the real attack hadn't even started yet. Wednesday morning, December 17th. Julian left for work at 7:30 just like any other day, kissing me goodbye and promising we would handle whatever mess Richard threw at us. I had a slow morning, still exhausted from the emotional whiplash of the day before. That envelope full of cash felt like a ghost weighting down my chest, and the way Richard looked at me like a piece of inventory made my skin crawl. I had no idea that at 8:42 a.m., an overnight FedEx package arrived at the Vance Pharmaceuticals headquarters. It was addressed to Julian Vance, and security sent it straight up to the top floor. Julian's assistant handed it to him, mentioning casually that it was an overnight delivery marked private and confidential. Julian closed his office door and ripped the package open. Inside were 4 high-gloss 8x10 photos, a 2-page investigation report with a Garrett Investigations letterhead, and a note written on Richard's personal stationery. It was that familiar ink pen handwriting Julian had seen his entire life. She took it. "I'm sorry you have to find out the truth this way, Julian, but you need to see her for who she really is. Come see me when you're ready to talk about next steps." Dad. The photos showed me entering and leaving the commercial real estate office. Going in, I looked exhausted and heavy. Coming out, I was holding a brown manila envelope. The close-up shot perfectly caught the expression on my face, which looked like pure relief. And of course I felt relieved. I had just finished my daily to-do list, finally signed the lease on my own little bakery, and the worst part of my day was over. But the photos didn't include that context. They just showed a woman who had been offered a massive payoff a few hours earlier, now standing outside a high-end commercial real estate agency looking completely unburdened. The investigation report seamlessly filled in the rest of the narrative Richard wanted. Subject departed the meeting location at 12:52 p.m. Subject then proceeded directly to the Back Bay Commercial Real Estate Transaction Center. Subject exited at 3:15 p.m. carrying a document envelope. This behavioral pattern is highly consistent with actions taken immediately following a major financial settlement and property transfer. The final line was heavily circled in red pen. Subject is visible, holding a document folder with legal markings, matching the scale of the property transfer paperwork provided during the meeting. I wasn't holding the deed to some luxury seaport restaurant. It was just a regular lease for a tiny corner shop. But the private investigator got paid to deliver the facts Richard wanted to see. Julian stared at those photos for about 6 seconds, and then he started laughing. At 8:50 a.m., my phone rang. I was in the kitchen testing out a new recipe with my coffee still steaming on the counter. "Sarah," Julian said. His voice sounded strange, light, almost amused, which didn't match the words coming out of his mouth at all. "Did you take my dad's money?" My whole body went rigid. "What? No, I told you everything last night." "I know you didn't." He was still laughing, that kind of manic laugh that comes when something is so absurd it drives you crazy. "But my dad thinks you did. He just sent me irrefutable proof. The only problem is, his proof is a bunch of photos of you yesterday afternoon going to sign the lease for your little bakery. The same bakery you texted me to complain about because the building's heating was blasting too high at 4 p.m. So, the photos were real, but the story he built around them was a complete lie. My hand froze mid-air holding my coffee cup, and I set it down very slowly. He's framing me. Yeah, and Sarah, the scariest part is, if he's willing to frame you just to get you out of the picture, what else is he capable of? What else has he done in the past? That question hung heavy between us, bringing a terrifying realization we couldn't fully comprehend yet. Don't change a single plan, Julian said, his tone turning cold. Act like nothing happened. Act like we have no idea he sent this. I need time to think. But Sarah, he just made the biggest mistake of his life. What do you mean? He thinks he's destroying you, but he's actually showing us exactly what his bottom line is. And we are going to keep track of every single receipt. Later that evening, Julian got home at 6:15, much earlier than a typical Wednesday. He was carrying the leather briefcase I had bought him, and he set it down on the kitchen table before pulling out the manila envelope. I want you to see exactly what he sent with your own eyes. Holding those photos in my hands made the whole thing feel so much more vicious. The high-definition professional quality perfectly captured my exhaustion and that sudden look of relief. It was an incredibly normal moment from my everyday life, now weaponized and turned against me. The investigation report was filled with lies wrapped in clean, analytical language. The real details, like the exact times I walked in and out, were completely twisted to fit a totally fabricated motive. And right there in Richard's handwriting were those words, "She took it." I dug into my bag and pulled out my actual lease for the bakery. The copy had a clear timestamp right on it. 3:10 p.m. Security deposit, $13,500. I set it down right next to that fake report claiming I had just cashed in on $500,000 in a luxury property. Truth and lies sat side by side on our kitchen table, and the contrast was stunning. He can't handle being the guy who got told no, Julian said, tapping the photos calmly. Because if you say no to $500,000, what does that make him? A bitter old man who tried to put a price tag on his son's fiancée and got slapped right in the face. I stared down at my lease, the actual proof of my real life. So, he'd rather forge evidence than accept that I'm not the greedy woman he wants me to be. Exactly. Julian opened his laptop, pulling up the Massachusetts wiretapping laws on the screen. And that means he's desperate. When people are backed into a corner, or when they're incredibly arrogant, they make mistakes. He turned the screen toward me. Massachusetts is a two-party consent state. You can't record someone without them knowing. But there's a specific exception. If you explicitly tell the other person you're recording for record-keeping purposes, and they don't object, it's completely legal. I can record his voice. A cold look came over Julian's eyes. I just have to tell him I'm doing it. If I frame it as wanting to learn about business negotiation and corporate management from his vast experience, his massive ego will absolutely let me do it. You want to record your father? I want to know how many more secrets he's hiding. If he's willing to fake evidence to cover up a failed bribe, he's definitely done much dirtier things. What is he doing right now? I want to know his real leverage before we decide how to hit back. Julian looked at me. Let's give him exactly what he thinks he bought. Let's pretend you're feeling guilty, and that I'm hurt but trying to forgive you. Let him think his plan worked flawlessly. Then we sit back and watch what he exposes about himself when he thinks he's already won. I got it. We were going to stage a brutal relationship breakdown. We were going to let Richard watch us slowly fall apart. And while he was enjoying the show, we would be gathering everything in the dark. We need burner phones, I said. Encrypted messaging apps. We have to live two parallel lives. The one we show him and the real one. Julian smiled. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was that cold chuckle a son gives when he realizes his father isn't a family member he can trust, but a venomous snake he has to outsmart. I'll go to a big box store during my lunch break tomorrow and get prepaid burner phones with cash. We'll set up Signal and make all the messages self-destruct after 24 hours. We also need code words. Today was boring means everything is safe. The morning was interesting means new evidence. Can we talk later means it's urgent and we need to meet in person. From now on, our regular phones are strictly for show. He opened a black moleskin notebook he usually used for tracking pharmaceutical research. On the very first page, he wrote, Timeline. We document everything. Dates, conversations, financial tracks, we build a case. A case for what? I don't know yet. But if he's willing to destroy you just for some ridiculous marriage alliance, he is definitely hiding a much bigger scandal. We weren't just playing defense anymore. We became undercover investigators in our own lives, with no idea what kind of horrifying secrets we were about to unearth. Thursday, December 18th. Julian used his lunch break to buy 2 cheap prepaid phones, $40 off-brand devices that couldn't be traced back to either of our names. That night, we set up the encrypted app. Our regular phones completely turned into a stage. On Friday, I texted Julian, "Everything just feels so suffocating lately. I need some space." His reply, "I understand. Take all the time you need." Meanwhile, on the encrypted app, "Your dad called me twice today. I didn't answer." Perfect. Let him think you're eaten alive by guilt. I'm going to do the first recording this weekend. We were living a double life within our own relationship. One part was performed for imaginary surveillance cameras, because if Richard could hire a detective to take photos of me, what else was he doing? The other part was our private freezing reality. Sunday, December 21st. Julian went to his father's mansion in Cambridge for their usual dinner. These family dinners always felt more like corporate board meetings than actual family time. Before leaving our apartment, he opened the voice memos app on his iPhone. "Dad, I'm planning to record our conversations from now on," Julian said at dinner, putting his phone right out in the open on the dining table. "I want to use these discussions as notes for my executive development. I want to learn from you." Richard stopped slicing his steak for a second. "That's unusual. You always taught me to keep a clear paper trail and document business practices," Julian replied smoothly. "Think of it as my executive education. We're talking about strategy, mergers, and how you think through crises. I want to study your approach systematically." Richard studied him for a few seconds, then nodded, a self-satisfied smirk appearing on his face. "That makes sense, but I expect you to keep these recordings completely confidential." "Of course, this is strictly for my own review." Permission granted, legal consent established. The recording was officially running. That first dinner recording lasted 18 minutes and 32 seconds. Richard asked Julian how things were going with the Sarah situation. Julian said he was still processing everything and needed time to clear his head. "That's wise," Richard said. "This kind of thing is always painful at first, but you'll see it's for the best. Eleanor Sterling is exactly what Vance Pharmaceuticals needs right now. Arthur and I have already discussed the timeline. Once your engagement is finalized, this $400 million merger isn't just a cold business transaction anymore. It becomes a personal family alliance. It solidifies everything." Julian recorded every single word. The total entitlement in his voice when he mentioned Eleanor, the arrogance of assuming Julian would just walk straight into this arranged marriage, and that fatal phrase, "exactly what Vance Pharmaceuticals needs right now." Not what Julian needed, not what would make his son happy, but what was good for the company. We had his voice, his plan, and the pure arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. Over the next week, I started doing my part in the performance, too. On December 28th, the Vance Pharmaceuticals annual holiday gala was held a full month earlier than usual. The reason was entirely obvious now. Eleanor Sterling was attending as a guest of honor. This new arrangement needed to be put on display within their social circle. I went because Julian insisted that if I suddenly stopped showing up, it would look way too suspicious. I wore an incredibly plain black dress with zero jewelry, not even my engagement ring. I arrived at 6:45 p.m. and left completely alone by 8:20. When Richard walked up to me holding a glass of whiskey, wearing that signature satisfied smile, I barely looked him in the eye. "Sarah, I'm glad you could make it." "Julian insisted I come," I said, my voice completely flat and lifeless. "I hope you're starting to see things with a bit more clarity." I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to let him see exactly what he wanted to see: shame, withdrawal, and total defeat. "I'm trying to figure things out," I said. He actually chuckled, raising his glass slightly like he was toasting my surrender. 20 minutes later, I left the party and texted Julian from my car. "That was even harder than I thought it would be." His reply came back instantly. "You played it perfectly. He's completely hooked." But on the encrypted app, Julian wrote, "Every cold shoulder you give me in public is just another sleeping pill he's swallowing. The more he believes his own lie, the more room we have to dig into his real playbook." We were building two parallel realities. One was the reality in Richard's head, where Sarah Jenkins was being crushed by guilt and upper-class pressure, heading toward total self-destruction. The other was the reality we were actually living, where we were systematically documenting every single conversation, every assumption, and every piece of hard evidence that proved he wasn't just a control freak, but a man driven completely to the edge. And we were about to find out exactly how far over the edge he was. The end of December didn't just bring holiday lights and end-of-the-year reviews, it also brought a deep, unshakable exhaustion and a string of mornings where just looking at food made my stomach turn. For an executive chef who has to taste dozens of sauces a day, this was a total disaster. At first, I thought it was just the stress. Richard's pressure, the fake breakup we had to maintain every single day, the constant anxiety over being watched. Stress always does weird, destructive things to your body. I used to be a total night owl, but now I was crashing in bed by 9 p.m. completely out cold, waking up with dry heaves before I could even eat anything. My cycle tracking app showed I was 5 days late, then 7 days, then 10 days. My last period had been from November 24th to the 28th. My next cycle was supposed to start around December 22nd. It was now December 30th. During my lunch break, I walked to a chain pharmacy about 3 blocks from the restaurant. I stood in front of the family planning shelf for 10 full minutes, staring at the instructions on the back of the boxes like they could give me an answer other than the one I already knew. I bought 2 pregnancy tests and paid with cash. It was an incredibly irrational move because, honestly, nobody was tracking my credit card spending at a regular drugstore. But in a terrifying situation where a normal lease signing gets tracked by your future father-in-law and twisted into a bribe, extreme paranoia starts to feel like a completely reasonable form of self-defense. Those pregnancy tests sat in my office drawer for the entire afternoon. I pushed through the dinner rush, through checking endless menus, and through a coworker asking why I looked so pale and if I was getting sick. Just end-of-the-year exhaustion, I brushed it off. I took them home in my bag. I hadn't told Julian yet. If I was actually pregnant, I wanted to be 100% sure before dropping this massive variable into an equation that was already incredibly dangerous. Saturday morning, January 3rd. Julian left at 7:30 to go for his morning run along the Charles River. It was his unbreakable weekend routine, and that predictable consistency didn't just make him reliable, it also gave me the exact window of time I needed. By 8:15, I was sitting on the freezing white tile floor of our bathroom. 2 pregnancy tests sat on the edge of the sink. The instructions read, "Wait 3 minutes." So I waited, staring intensely at the display windows as if looking hard enough could somehow change the result. Both tests clearly showed the exact same word, pregnant. I pulled out my phone and did the math. Based on ovulation, conception happened right around November 20th to the 22nd. Today was January 3rd. I was 6 weeks pregnant. The due date was August 20th, 2026. When Richard opened that box full of cashier's checks and deeds, I was already pregnant. When he said a woman from my background had no business marrying into the Vance bloodline, I was already pregnant. When I walked out of that private room without touching a single cent of his money, I was already pregnant. While that private investigator was taking secret photos of me, while Julian and I were building our alliance, and while we were putting on a performance for Richard showing our relationship slowly dying, I had been pregnant the entire time. I was carrying his grandchild, and he had tried to buy me off to make me disappear forever. The realization hit me like wave after wave of freezing cold, each thought sharper and more bitter than the last. By 9:20, I was still sitting on that cold bathroom floor when I heard the sound of Julian's keys turning in the lock. He called out my name, getting back 20 minutes earlier than usual. I couldn't answer. My voice completely failed me in the face of that positive result, and the brutal timeline of conception. He found me in the bathroom, seeing how pale my face was and noticing the tests sitting on the edge of the sink. "Sarah," I looked up at him. "I'm pregnant." Julian dropped to his knees on the cold tile, his workout gear still damp with sweat. His expression shifted from pure shock to his mind racing to process the news, and finally to an intense tenderness that made my heart ache. "How long?" 6 weeks, due in August. I watched him fully absorb the reality, and then I cruelly added the final piece of the puzzle. "Julian, when your father tried to pay me to leave, I was already pregnant." His entire body went rigid. "You didn't know then?" "No, but he didn't either. He just arrogantly assumed he could erase me, toss some money my way, and frame me. And all the while, I was carrying your child, his actual grandchild." Julian pulled me into a tight embrace, his hand instinctively covering my stomach. Even though there was nothing to feel yet except dividing cells, those cells were about to completely change our entire war strategy. "What kind of man is he?" His voice cracked, unable to even finish the question because we both already knew the answer. A man who valued absolute control over his own flesh and blood. A man who calculated his son's marriage the same way he negotiated a corporate merger. A man who would maliciously forge evidence to ruin an innocent woman's reputation simply because she refused to be bought. We just sat there on the bathroom floor in the faint morning sunlight as the massive weight of our reality finally settled in. "This changes everything," Julian said finally. "I've mapped out the timeline. We can't afford to take our time anymore. We have to end this completely before you start showing." His mind had already switched into high-gear, precise calculation mode. "You're 6 weeks along. You'll start showing around 16 to 18 weeks. That's late February, early March at the latest. We have to accelerate our counterattack." "Yes." He stared at those undeniable pregnancy tests. "Now, we aren't just protecting ourselves. We are protecting our child. I want my father to know exactly what he came this close to destroying with his own hands." The stakes had changed. This was no longer just a matter of whether an unblessed relationship could survive. This was a generational war. This was about the kind of family environment our child would grow up in, what kind of grandfather he would have, and whether this toxic legacy of calculation and control would continue or be burned to the ground by our own hands. "He can never be a part of our child's life," I said through gritted teeth. "Our child will absolutely not live in his shadow, not after everything that has happened." Julian nodded. "Then we're going to expose exactly who he is to everyone. No private confrontations, we're going public." That Saturday, we organized all the materials we had gathered so far, 7 audio recordings from the past 2 weeks. In them, Richard spoke with increasing carelessness about the Sterling Capital merger, about Eleanor, and about the next steps after cleaning up the Sarah situation. Every single recording painted a picture of an arrogant man who truly believed he had cleared the board. But it wasn't enough. We needed a deeper weapon. We needed to know exactly what Richard was hiding. Why was he so desperate to control Julian's marriage? Why was this $400 million merger so vital to him that he was willing to risk losing his son entirely just to force it through? Monday, January 5th. Julian went back to the office with a completely renewed sense of purpose. As chief medical officer, he had legal access to core corporate documents, new drug development budgets, clinical trial reports, and third-party data audits. These were all part of his actual job description. He started pulling at the threads, and what he found was far worse and more corrupt than either of us could have imagined. Vance Pharmaceuticals was putting everything behind a new Alzheimer's drug called NeuroCalm. This drug was supposed to be the company's crown jewel for the next decade, and it was the core highlight attracting Sterling Capital's investment. The stated research budget was in the hundreds of millions, claiming to significantly slow down brain atrophy. Julian had been involved in the early stages of screening the drug components, but once it hit the critical phase 3 clinical trials, Richard had tightly locked down the data oversight. Now Julian finally understood why. Deep inside hidden financial audit files, Julian discovered a payment made to a Delaware company called Apex Bioanalytics, LLC, for $3.4 million, listed under Independent Clinical Data Strategic Assessment. Julian had spent a decade in the industry and knew every reputable clinical data contractor on the East Coast, but he had never heard of this name. He dug into the company's registration details, and it was a textbook shell corporation. No physical office address, no core employees, just an anonymous P.O. box in Delaware, and funds wired straight into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. And the executive signature authorizing this massive sum belonged to Richard Vance himself. Right after that, he uncovered another entity called Cornerstone Medical Consulting, which received $2.15 million for adverse event mitigation modeling. It was the exact same playbook, a Delaware shell company, an offshore account, and Richard's special authorization signature. Over a 2-year period, Julian tracked 12 identical suspicious transfers. A cumulative total of $12 million had been funneled into these non-existent companies under the guise of drug development expenses, vanishing into a gray area that couldn't be easily audited. But that wasn't even the worst part. Julian compared these entries against the hidden, original clinical trial logs. The truth was horrifying. Neurocalm, the drug being hyped as a miracle cure, showed severe cardiovascular side effects during Phase 3 trials, and its effectiveness was far lower than projected. That $12 million wasn't for research or consulting at all. It was hush money Richard used to secretly bribe third-party independent labs to alter safety data and silence whistleblowers. Even more sickening, not all the offshore accounts were under Richard's name alone. 2 of them listed Vivian Vance as a co-owner, the young third wife Richard married 3 years ago. Everyone had assumed it was just a wealthy older man's late-life romance, but now it looked a lot more like a conspiracy for money laundering and financial fraud. Julian took photos of every single falsified data comparison, every fake consulting invoice, and every wire transfer confirmation record. His father wasn't just a control freak, he was a cold-blooded fraud. He was gambling with patients' lives, and if the FDA ever uncovered the fraud, the entire Vance Group would collapse overnight. Late on the night of January 8th, on the encrypted Signal app, Julian. I found the shell companies. Your father has been faking the clinical data for our latest Alzheimer's drug. He washed $12 million through Delaware front companies to bribe the data reviewers. Vivian's name is on 2 of the laundering accounts as well. Me. How deep does the money go? Julian. Deep enough for the FDA and the SEC to shut down Vance Pharmaceuticals completely. That $400 million sterling merger wasn't a business expansion at all. I stared at the phone screen in our dark bedroom. Julian was lying right next to me, and I could feel the storm raging inside him. Richard's insane interference in Julian's marriage wasn't just about pride or social status. Vance Pharmaceuticals was facing total ruin because of a massive financial and data forgery black hole he had dug himself. The $400 million funding from Sterling Capital wasn't a springboard for growth. It was a lifeline to keep the company on life support, cover up the deficit, and balance the books before any random FDA audits. The marriage alliance wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of survival. That explained why Richard had become far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The next piece of lethal evidence came from the internal draft documents for the Sterling merger. Julian already had access to these files, since he would be responsible for merging the medical projects once the funding cleared. But hidden within those complex due diligence and equity distribution clauses was an addendum agreement that Richard probably assumed Julian would never read closely. The strategy and alliance agreement between families. 12 pages of paper, signed and dated October 15, 2025. That meant this document existed a full 2 months before Richard Vance ever sat down across from me with that manila envelope full of cash trying to force me out. The agreement spelled it out in the coldest legal terms imaginable. To solidify the partnership and long-term strategic vision, the Vance and Sterling families will enter into a mutually beneficial alliance. To put that into plain English, Julian was required to marry Eleanor Sterling by December of 2026. In exchange for this arranged marriage, Vance Pharmaceuticals would receive a 60% voting share in the newly merged company instead of the originally planned 55%. For a mere 5% of board control and that life-saving $400 million lifeline, Richard had already used his own son's marriage as a bargaining chip and sold it off before he ever tried to buy me out. Right behind that, Julian found a draft for a prenuptial agreement. The date on it was November 15th. It obviously wasn't meant for us. It was custom-made for the match Richard had already decided on, Julian and Eleanor. It was a 30-page document drafted by a top-tier law firm, and the clauses were incredibly hostile. If either party filed for divorce within the first 10 years of marriage, they would forfeit all equity in the newly merged company. If either party caused any public scandal, it would trigger severe financial penalties. This marriage was never meant to be a romantic union. It was a mutual business contract disguised as love, holding both of them hostage. He drafted all of this before he even tried to bribe you, Julian said, his voice as cold as ice as we sat at the kitchen table, looking at the evidence spread out like a terminal diagnosis. He did it before he even framed you. Sarah, he's been planning this for months. You were never just some unexpected complication. You were just a tiny pebble sitting in the middle of a track he had laid out a long time ago. I looked over those dates. The alliance agreement in October, the draft prenup in November, and the bribe in December. Richard's timeline for erasing me was just as precise and unfeeling as his launch plan for a new drug: level the obstacle, clear out the foundation, and build the empire he actually wanted. Too bad for him, I refused to be leveled. The final piece of the puzzle came from an internal, encrypted email archive that Julian managed to access through his executive permissions. It was an email exchange from September of 2025 between Richard and his current wife, Vivian. This was before any of this had even started, back when I didn't even know I was a target. The subject line read, "Restructuring Timeline." Richard: once the sterling funding is secured, we will be able to balance the Neurocom deficit before the annual FDA audit. The timeline is incredibly tight. The engagement must be finalized by March at the latest, and the wedding completed by December. Capital transfer must occur in the first quarter of next year. Vivian: what about the chef girl, Sarah? Richard: I will handle her. She is not material to the outcome. Not material to the outcome. That was my exact weight in his eyes. I wasn't a human being. I wasn't the woman his son loved deeply. I wasn't even a problem worth taking seriously. I was just a step in a process that needed to be handled, like dealing with an expired health inspection certificate. By late February, we had pieced together the entire picture. Richard Vance wasn't just a control freak. He was a cornered animal backed right up to the edge of a cliff. He had falsified clinical data that could take down the entire company and laundered tens of millions into shell corporations. This $400 million merger had absolutely nothing to do with a grand business vision. It was entirely a cover-up for a disgusting scientific and financial fraud. Pairing Julian and Eleanor off like livestock was simply the collateral Arthur Sterling demanded before he would hand over that life-saving cash. In this deal, the very last thing Richard cared about was his son's actual happiness, or the existence of the grandchild currently growing inside me. We now had 9 high-definition recordings of Richard discussing this dirty plan. We had the core financial documents proving $12 million in money laundering and clinical data forgery. We had the alliance agreement proving his premeditated scheme, the draft prenup, and the emails proving Vivian's involvement. In total, we had 41 pieces of irrefutable evidence: audio files, photos, wire transfers, and timeline spreadsheets. Everything was organized into categories on Julian's military-grade encrypted hard drive, backed up to a secure cloud, and printed out into 3 heavy black presentation binders. Late on the night of January 22nd, we were in the kitchen. Julian turned to me and said, "We have more than enough evidence. We could go to the FBI or the board tomorrow. We could end this right now. But I want to see exactly how far he's willing to go. I want to document every single piece of malice he commits while he thinks he has this completely won." I understood him perfectly. This wasn't just about stopping Richard anymore. This was about stripping away his mask so completely that nobody could ever make excuses for him again. We couldn't let the board, the Sterling Group, or anyone else find a loophole by saying he was just an overprotective father, or he's just a shrewd businessman. We were going to make everyone witness exactly what Richard Vance was willing to destroy just to keep his control. So our performance continued. February brought the final phase. I started making it incredibly obvious in public that I was distancing myself from Julian. I took off my engagement ring, deliberately letting my kitchen staff see my bare finger. I openly rejected Julian multiple times when he came to the restaurant to pick me up after work. In our team chat logs, I would occasionally leave vague, open-ended messages like, "I just need some space to think." My boss, the strict but incredibly protective executive chef, pulled me aside at the end of February. "Sarah, honey, are you doing okay lately? You seem completely checked out." I forced my voice to crack just a bit, mimicking real heartbreak. "I'm dealing with some personal things. Julian and we're reevaluating our relationship." A look of deep maternal worry came over her face. "If you need to take a few days off to rest." "No, work is good. It keeps my mind off things." I let my eyes well up with tears at the perfect moment. Not too much, just enough to make it entirely believable. Within half a day, anyone who was even slightly connected to the Boston culinary scene knew the gossip. Sarah Jenkins was heartbroken. The cross-class engagement was about to fall apart. And those rumors made their way straight to Richard Vance's ears, exactly as planned. On February 3rd, I sent out cancellation emails to all our wedding vendors. The venue fee for the New England Historic Library, the deposits for the flower farms, and the reservation for the Boston Symphony String Quartet. Every email was polite but vague. Due to a change in circumstances, we need to postpone the wedding indefinitely. Some vendors refunded a portion of the deposits, while others kept the cancellation fees. Julian paid all the cancellation penalties very publicly using his personal checks, deliberately letting his administrative assistant see them. He framed himself perfectly as the desperate, heartbroken fiancé who was powerless to fix his relationship. On February 8th, I changed my Facebook relationship status from engaged to Julian Vance to single, and I made sure to set it to public so Richard's informants would see it. Within 3 hours, there were 52 comments under the post. "Oh my gosh, what happened? You deserve so much better. Are you okay?" My mom called me right away. We had already filled her in on the situation so she could play along, but her voice still carried real anxiety. "Sweetie, everyone is asking what's going on. The relatives are blowing up my phone." "I'm handling it, Mom. I just need a little time." "Do you want to come back to the farm for the weekend?" "Maybe, I'll let you know." It was professional, controlled, and distant enough to be entirely convincing, but we kept our communication line open. My mom understood me. She always knew that sometimes, to win the ultimate war, you have to endure a long, painful process. Meanwhile, between February 10th and the 20th, Eleanor Sterling managed to cross paths with Julian, coincidentally, 5 separate times. The way Richard arranged these accidental meetings was just as blunt and aggressive as a developer clearing out a tenement building. When Julian went to visit Sterling Capital, Eleanor happened to be in the office. When he was dining at a Michelin-starred restaurant, she happened to be waiting for her late father, leading to a casual, "Do you mind if I join you since I'm waiting?" She was even deliberately seated right next to Julian at a medical charity gala. Eleanor was a flawless elite. Elite education, old money upbringing, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to wield power smoothly without ever looking aggressive. She was kind to Julian, keeping her boundaries perfectly balanced, never overeager but never cold either. But what she didn't know was that Julian recorded every single interaction. She had no idea Julian was silently documenting this orchestrated puppet show, and she didn't know that she herself was just a piece of leverage pushed forward by her billionaire father to close a deal, exactly like Julian. On February 14th, Valentine's Day. Perhaps due to some cruel sense of humor on Richard's part, Eleanor happened to show up yet again at the exact restaurant where Julian was having a business lunch. "Julian, what a coincidence," she said with a smile that actually looked somewhat genuine. "I was supposed to meet my father, but he got held up in a meeting. Mind if I sit here for a bit?" Of course not. The two of them started out with boring small talk about the macroeconomy and Boston's terrible traffic. Then she carefully pivoted to the real topic. "I heard your engagement was called off. I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly tough." "Thanks," Julian replied. "It's complicated. If you ever need someone to talk to who actually understands the suffocating pressure of a family business, I am always here." The offer just hung there in the air, sounding completely flawless, innocent, and perfectly timed. The recording device in Julian's pocket caught every single syllable. When he played the audio back for me that night, I could hear the exact subtext Eleanor didn't even realize she was projecting. "I am ready to step into this position. I accept this arranged marriage. Our fathers have already shaken hands on this, and I am ready to fulfill my duty whenever you are." She wasn't necessarily a malicious person. She was just showing a complete entitled obedience to this transaction, entirely blind to the harm she was participating in. In a way, that made it feel even sadder. By late February, Richard was completely satisfied. Sarah was fading out of the picture, and Julian was slowly being reeled in by Eleanor. His script was playing out perfectly. He stopped checking in constantly and dropped that interrogative tone he used to press Julian on his progress. He thought he had won. He thought that glaring problem had simply dissolved on its own, exactly according to his precise calculations. That was the exact moment we booked an appointment with attorney Grace Feldman. Grace was a top-tier, iron-fisted lawyer who specialized in corporate whistleblower protection and family trust litigation. She had 20 years of experience dealing with incredibly complex cases where personal relationship disputes overlapped with fatal corporate financial scandals. Her office sat on the 40th floor of a downtown financial district skyscraper, overlooking the entire Boston seaport. We met with her on February 22nd. By then, I was 13 weeks pregnant, and if I wore anything tight, a tiny bump was just barely starting to show. Julian and I sat across from her massive, solid wood conference table, watching her review all the bombs we had brought with us. 9 clear audio recordings, 12 internal financial documents proving data forgery and money laundering, the fabricated private investigator tracking report, wire transfers to Delaware shell companies, the strategy and alliance agreement, the absurd draft prenuptial agreement, our email logs, and a highly detailed cross-referenced timeline spreadsheet. Grace spread the paperwork across the table like a prosecutor building a criminal puzzle. In a way, she was our prosecutor now. After 40 minutes of total silence as she flipped through the pages, she finally looked up, a flash of pure shock and intense focus in her eyes. This is absolutely breathtaking. Severe clinical data fraud violating FDA regulations, securities fraud and money laundering involving tens of millions of dollars, attempted extortion through manufactured evidence using a hired investigator, and she held up the alliance agreement. Premeditated manipulation of human lives using a personal marriage as a bargaining chip for corporate fraud. Mr. Vance, your father has personally left behind a textbook, flawless chain of evidence for his own total destruction. When is our best opening move? Julian asked. That depends entirely on your ultimate goal. Do you want him facing criminal charges? Do you want civil damages? Do you want him stripped of corporate control? Or do you want him completely destroyed? Julian turned his head to look at me. I gently placed my hand over my stomach. Through my heavy cashmere sweater, the curve wasn't obvious yet, but we both knew exactly what was growing there. All of the above, I said coldly. We want everyone to see exactly what he did. We are not handling this behind closed doors. We want every single stakeholder to witness it firsthand. Grace nodded slowly, a sharp smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. In that case, you need a public venue with the absolute heaviest witnesses present. Core board members, business partners, and major investment moguls who cannot be easily swayed by a public relations cleanup team. The final signing ceremony for the Sterling merger, Julian replied instantly. March 10th. Arthur Sterling and his core board members will all be in the room. My father will be there too, waiting to sign his name to this complete fraud just to get his hands on that life-saving cash. If you drop this evidence in that room, it will be completely catastrophic. Grace finished the sentence for him. The maximum concentration of high-net-worth witnesses and absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. She began mapping out our tactical strategy. Who should speak first, the exact order to present the evidence, and how to frame this so it wouldn't look like a petty family drama. We needed to pin it down strictly as a severe case of corporate and medical fraud accompanied by intentional character assassination. We left her office with a perfected plan. 3 meticulously organized black presentation binders, evidence printed out and categorized by its level of lethality, digital backups ready to be projected on a screen, and a surgical ice-cold script for Julian to read. The signing ceremony was scheduled for March 10th at 10 a.m. The location was the top-floor boardroom of Sterling Capital Group in the Boston Seaport. Arthur Sterling and 4 senior partners were set to attend. Richard would be arriving completely loaded with victorious arrogance. Eleanor most likely wouldn't be there. Old-school capitalists preferred to finish the bloody business inside the boardroom before inviting family to the celebration dinner. We had 8 days to prepare, 8 days to rehearse our talking points, 8 days to ensure that when we pushed that door open, every piece of evidence would be as solid as iron, leaving absolutely no room for him to argue, defend himself, or spin it as a necessary evil for the greater good of the company. We were going to prove who he really was. A tyrant who stomped on his own flesh and blood for absolute power. A criminal who used money, frame-ups, and intimidation to clear his path. A thief who pocketed massive medical research funds, a pimp who sold his own son's marriage like a piece of livestock, and a monster who tried to completely erase an innocent pregnant woman simply because she refused to let him put a price tag on her life. On March 2nd, Julian called his father. Of course, this conversation was recorded too. Dad, I've been thinking things over. I think you were right. I need to focus on the future of this family and on what Vance Pharmaceuticals needs most. Richard's breathing hitched on the other end of the line for a split second. Then, an incredibly fake warmth flooded through the receiver. Julian, I am so incredibly relieved. You're finally seeing the bigger picture. I want to speak at the Sterling signing ceremony. I want to present our joint vision for the merger to them, to prove that this deal means just as much to me." "That is absolutely perfect. Arthur is going to highly appreciate hearing that from you. March 10th at 10 a.m. I'll add you to the core agenda for the day. See you Tuesday, son." Richard had just personally authorized the security pass for his own destruction. He had absolutely no clue. But in 4 days, everyone else would. Tuesday morning, March 10th. A light rain was falling over Boston. I wore a dark gray tailored blazer over a silk cream blouse, paired with sharp black trousers. The 15-week baby bump was cleverly hidden under the smart cut, unless you were explicitly staring at it. That morning, I put my engagement ring back on, that emerald flashing with a cold, sharp light in the morning sun. It was the only thing left from the Vance family that was actually worth keeping. Julian wore a deep blue custom Tom Ford suit, with his late grandmother's emerald cufflinks catching the light, perfectly matching my ring. We had decided weeks ago that we were going to honor the one adult who had actually loved him, while completely dismantling the tyrant who used him. We took a cab from Beacon Hill to the seaport. In the back seat, our fingers were tightly locked together. Neither of us said a word. Everything that needed to be said had been rehearsed 1,000 times, and every emotion had already been converted into hard evidence inside those binders. "Last chance," Julian said, looking at me as the cab pulled up to Sterling Capital's gleaming glass skyscraper. "We can still turn around. We can find a way to handle this that isn't so explosive." I looked down at our joined hands, looked at my ring, and finally let my eyes rest on my stomach, where our child was growing. "No way," I said firmly. "He needs to know exactly what he came this close to destroying, and everyone in this room needs to see him for exactly who he is." We walked into the lobby at 9:17 a.m. and took the elevator straight to the update on the 40th floor. The receptionist guided us toward Executive Boardroom 1. Richard was already seated. He was sitting in the guest of honor spot directly to the right of Arthur Sterling, looking completely relaxed and entirely victorious. The moment he saw me walk in right behind Julian, the smile on his face completely froze. "What is she doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice turning sharp and aggressive. Julian calmly placed his heavy briefcase onto the luxurious mahogany table. "Sarah is my fiancée. She has every right to be in the room for a decision that impacts our entire future." Arthur Sterling frowned, looking completely confused. "Richard, I thought you said earlier that—" "There's clearly been a misunderstanding here," Richard interrupted quickly, the veins on his forehead starting to throb. "Julian, perhaps we should go step outside and talk privately first. Before any of you sign a single piece of paper," Julian said, his voice incredibly loud, cold, and cutting right through the room. "There is something every single person sitting at this table needs to look at." He snapped open his briefcase with total authority. The room itself was custom-built for power games. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows showed a gray, overcast Boston skyline. A top-tier mahogany conference table that could seat 20 people was surrounded by premium leather chairs, the ultimate temple where decisions about massive wealth were made. The people inside included the capital giant Arthur Sterling sitting at the head of the table, 4 senior board partners who controlled the flow of billions, Richard Vance, and the 2 of us standing there ready to drop a nuclear bomb. Scattered across the table were the unsigned merger documents, just waiting for the final strokes of a pen to close a historic $400 million deal. Julian checked his watch, 9:58 a.m. "This will only take 20 minutes of your time," Julian said, locking eyes with everyone in the room. "Once I am finished showing you this, you can decide whether you still want to sign this document with my father." Julian pulled out the first black presentation binder. He flipped it open, revealing the fabricated private investigator's report. On December 16, 2025, my father invited Sarah to a private lunch. He offered her a cashier's check for $500,000 and a piece of commercial property in the seaport, demanding that she sign an NDA, break off our engagement, and get out of Boston permanently. Julian paused for a beat. Sarah completely refused. She didn't touch a single cent of that money. He tossed Kenneth Garrett's fake report right into the middle of the table, showcasing that disgusting fictional narrative about how the subject supposedly reacted after cashing a big check. And then, my father hired a private investigator. When Sarah went to a regular commercial real estate agency that afternoon to sign a lease for her own little neighborhood bakery, this detective took secret photos of her. He then manufactured this report to create the illusion that Sarah had accepted a bribe. Julian slammed a copy of my actual lease agreement right next to the fake report. The timestamp read 3:10 p.m., and the monthly rent was $4,500. This is what Sarah was actually doing that afternoon. My father paid someone to take a completely ordinary, everyday errand and intentionally twist it into evidence of a crime and a betrayal. A female board director from Sterling Capital pushed her glasses up her nose and leaned forward, carefully comparing the two documents. Her face remained blank, but her eyes showed total concentration. Julian pressed play on his phone. The audio from that first recording echoed through the boardroom. Richard's cold, arrogant voice filled the space. A cashier's check for $500,000. Sign this non-disclosure agreement and disappear completely. A woman from your background has no business marrying into the Vance bloodline. Then, Julian pulled up our timeline on the big projector screen. December 16th. The massive bribe is offered. December 16th. The detective takes the surveillance photos. December 17th. The manufactured report is delivered to Julian's office with a handwritten note saying she took it. Because an innocent woman refused to let him buy her off, my father tried to frame her as a greedy scam artist. Julian let that accusation hang in the dead silence of the boardroom for 5 full seconds before continuing. And that brings up a very fatal question. If my father is willing to shamelessly forge evidence just to get rid of a chef, what else is he willing to forge? He flipped open the second, much thicker presentation binder. This one held our financial tracks and the FDA audit documents. As Chief Medical Officer of Vance Pharmaceuticals, I have core access to our research and development budgets. While reviewing our internal financial statements, I discovered massive payments made to several highly suspicious vendors: Apex Bioanalytics LLC and Cornerstone Medical Consulting. These are all shell corporations registered in Delaware. No employees, no physical offices, and they have never conducted a single real medical analysis. He dropped 12 wire transfer records onto the mahogany table. 12 separate transfers over a 3-year period. A total of $12 million was laundered directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These companies do not exist. The money was moved overseas to cover up real corruption. This is textbook embezzlement, money laundering, and severe federal tax fraud. Another senior partner from Sterling Capital immediately pulled out his phone and started frantically taking pictures of the wire transfer receipts on the table. And it gets even better. 2 of those laundering accounts list Vivian Vance, my father's current wife, as a co-owner. The dirty money in just those 2 accounts totals $4.5 million. The partner was now writing at a furious pace in his notepad. The female director's face had turned completely stone cold. Julian then slid the strategy and alliance agreement directly in front of Arthur Sterling. Mr. Sterling, this agreement was drafted by you and my father back on October 15th, 2025. That is a full 2 months before my father ever tried to use $500,000 to force Sarah out. Arthur Sterling picked up the document, his eyes scanning the cold clauses. As he realized what he was looking at, the muscles in his jaw twitched violently. This agreement explicitly outlines a so-called family alliance. In plain terms, I was required to marry your daughter Eleanor by this December. In exchange for this arranged marriage, Vance Pharmaceuticals would gain an extra 5% of voting shares in the newly merged company. My father wrote my marriage into a business merger as a bargaining chip. Arthur Sterling kept his eyes locked onto that piece of paper, the color completely draining from his face. So, my father trying to bribe me had nothing to do with me being an unexpected complication, I added, my voice cutting through the room. I just happened to be standing in the way of the dirty red carpet he had already laid out for your daughter. He had to erase me. Julian followed up by tossing down the draft prenuptial agreement. This was drawn up in November, 30 pages of clauses designed to turn a marriage into a 10-year prison sentence, using severe financial penalties to keep any scandal from going public. He put more effort into this hostile contract than he ever did into drug development. This was his malicious plan all along. The entire boardroom went completely breathless. The only sounds left were pages turning, the clicks of phone cameras, and the scratching of pens on paper. Finally, Julian dropped the ultimate hammer. You must be wondering why my father was so desperate to control this marriage. Why would he risk total ruin and use such disgusting, low-class methods just to ensure Sterling Capital's funding went through? The projector screen switched to the most lethal chart of all. It was a side-by-side data comparison showing the real versus the falsified clinical trials for Neurocalm, along with the evidence of Richard shifting funds to patch the holes, and the secret email detailing how to hide the deficit from the FDA audit. The clinical data for Neurocalm is a complete fraud. The drug is not only ineffective, but it carries fatal cardiovascular side effects. Vance Pharmaceuticals is currently drowning in debt and entirely broken. My father embezzled tens of millions of dollars to bribe third-party reviewers and used shell companies to launder the money and cook the books. If the FDA uncovers the truth during next month's annual audit, this company will face total destruction. Mr. Sterling, this $400 million funding was never about a powerful business expansion. Julian's voice echoed with pure authority, sounding like a judge delivering a sentence. This was a desperate survival scheme to cover up 3 years of financial and academic fraud. He needed your cash to fill his black hole, and the reason he wanted to drag your daughter down with him was to ensure that when the bomb finally went off, Sterling Capital would be so deeply entangled that you would have no choice but to clean up his mess just to save yourselves. Julian snapped the black presentation binder shut, his gaze piercing through his father like a sword. This was your choice, Dad. This is the empire you built. Arthur Sterling stood up. The Wall Street giant didn't yell or scream. He didn't need to. Get out! His voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly quiet and carried an absolute finality. Richard tried to open his mouth to defend himself. Arthur, this is a complete setup. If you would just listen to me. Get out of my office right now. Arthur looked at him like he was staring at a pile of rotting garbage. The 4 board members sat entirely still, watching Richard like statues. They were the ultimate lethal witnesses. All deals are completely terminated indefinitely, Arthur Sterling announced coldly. Not only that, but I am having my legal team immediately submit these offshore accounts and data forgery receipts to the SEC and the FDA, and I will be authorizing my private attorneys to file a full-scale lawsuit against you for attempted fraud, for trying to maliciously loop my daughter into your Ponzi scheme. Arthur looked at Richard with pure disgust. You have the nerve to come into my room and talk to me about family honor and business alliances? Those 2 things mean absolutely nothing coming from you. Richard's face went entirely white, and he whipped around to face Julian, his eyes bloodshot. You ruined everything. You personally destroyed this company. You destroyed it yourself, Julian said softly. The moment you decided to treat me as a tradable asset instead of your son, the moment you arrogantly assumed you could put a price tag on Sarah, you brought all of this on yourself. Arthur was already gathering his files from the table, signaling to his directors that this catastrophic meeting was over. I took a step forward and then, very slowly and deliberately, I placed my hand over my stomach. In that specific position, the faint curve of my 15-week bump was completely obvious. Richard's eyes dropped to my hand. The deep flush on his face vanished in an instant, leaving him looking like paper. I am 16 weeks pregnant, Mr. Vance, I said. My voice was eerily calm, completely flat, like I was reading an unarguable autopsy report. When you sat across from me with $500,000 and a contract demanding I disappear, I was 6 weeks pregnant. You tried to use money to buy out the existence of your own grandchild, and when you found out I couldn't be bought, you tried to forge evidence to destroy his mother's life. I didn't move my hand. I wanted to make sure every single powerful person sitting around that massive mahogany table saw exactly what was happening. And just a second ago, you came within inches of selling out your son's future and the safety of this child just to fund a dirty corporate scam. I looked down at the man who used to think he controlled the world. This is who you really are. And now, every major player in this room can see it perfectly. The room fell into a dead silence. Arthur Sterling turned and walked straight out the door without tossing another word in Richard's direction. A $400 million deal vanished into thin air in a single second. And along with it, the unbreakable web of control Richard thought he had built crashed down too. Richard Vance looked at Julian, then at me, then at the lethal evidence scattered across the table that was enough to send him straight to federal prison, and finally at the merger documents that would never bear his signature. Right then, he looked like he had aged 10 years in a split second. He walked out the doors of Sterling Capital like an empty shell that had lost its soul. It was exactly 10:27 a.m. The heavy thud of his footsteps echoed down the long hallway, a hallway that had just witnessed a pharmaceutical empire built over 30 years collapse into total ruin in exactly 22 minutes. And the aftershocks hit much faster and harder than I ever could have imagined. Tuesday, March 10th, 5:30 p.m. Richard returned to the Vance Pharmaceuticals headquarters to clean out his executive office. 27 years of personal belongings, Wall Street Person of the Year trophies, and models of the initial patent certificates he was so proud of were brutally crammed into cardboard boxes by security personnel. His former assistant stood nearby, watching with professional sympathy, though the corners of her mouth couldn't help but twitch upward. Wednesday, March 11th. Vivian urgently consulted the most ruthless divorce lawyer in Boston. From the second word leaked out of the Sterling boardroom, she knew that if she didn't distance herself from Richard's fraud immediately, she would be facing jail time right alongside him. Thursday, March the 12th. The headline on the front page of the Boston Globe business section read, "Vance Pharmaceuticals Chief Resigns Amid Major Financial Fraud Allegations." Even though the article carefully used phrases like allegedly and confirmed by anonymous sources, the core insider details were completely exposed. Richard had tried to use an arranged marriage to force through a corporate merger, only for the potential investors to be hit with irrefutable evidence of data forgery and money laundering right at the signing ceremony, killing the deal completely. Friday, March 13th, 2 p.m. Vance Pharmaceuticals called an emergency board meeting. All 11 independent directors attended. A motion was introduced to completely remove Richard Vance from his roles as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman, citing substantial and undeniable evidence of financial embezzlement, gross breach of fiduciary duty, and medical fraud. The vote was 11-0. Given Julian's total transparency and cooperation with federal regulators during the exposure of the scandal, the board voted unanimously to appoint him as interim CEO to help the FBI clean house. The dictatorial empire Richard spent 30 years building completely stripped him away in just 6 days. The following Monday, the Wall Street Journal published an in-depth feature titled "Family Betrayal or Corporate Correction." The tone of the piece was heavily slanted in Julian's favor, painting him as a young medical executive who firmly chose to defend patient safety and business ethics over his own father's tyranny. It also praised me as a resilient fiancé who refused to be bought out by cash and fought back with pure facts when framed. The glossy old money prenuptial agreements were ruthlessly mocked as pimp sheets that read colder than corporate acquisition contracts. The Boston culinary world rallied around me with a vengeance. My old-school French chef boss did an interview with a business magazine, stating in her heavy accent, "Sarah Jenkins is one of the most talented chefs I have ever met. But more importantly, she has a rare kind of backbone. When someone tried to use dirty money to shut her mouth, she said no. When someone tried to throw mud on her name, she smashed their face with the truth. That is what a real professional looks like." That same week, I received 3 partnership proposals from top-tier restaurants in the industry. They explicitly wanted me as a partner, not just because of my cooking, but because I had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was a person who absolutely could not be bought. That Tuesday, Eleanor Sterling sent me a direct message on LinkedIn. "I had absolutely no idea about the details of what my father and your father were trading behind our backs. I am completely disgusted. I hope you and Julian are doing well. I never wanted to be a tool used to break you guys apart." I chose to believe her. She was just another pawn in a game where she couldn't even see the whole board. Some people get weaponized by their powerful fathers and spend their entire lives never realizing they were just chips in someone else's power play. On March 18th, Richard Vance was officially handed over to the Department of Justice for federal investigation. He kept a 6% non-voting minority stake in the company, but was banned for life from ever participating in any operations or decisions at Vance Pharmaceuticals. He was completely exiled from the kingdom he created. That exact same day, Vivian officially filed for divorce. Along with citing irreconcilable differences, she added a clause for malicious financial fraud inducement, demanding 50% of his marital assets. This immediately triggered a much more lethal forensic accounting investigation. The process would likely take months, but it was guaranteed to strip clean every single cent of dirty money hidden away in the Cayman Islands. During those first few weeks, Richard tried to contact Julian twice. On March 20th, a handwritten note on personal stationery arrived. "Let's talk. You are my son, after all." Julian didn't even open the envelope. He fed it straight into the paper shredder. On March 25th, a text message came through. "No matter what I did, no matter how big of a mistake I made, blood is thicker than water. You will always be a Vance." Julian blocked the number instantly. On March 29th, Julian filed a legal petition with the Boston Superior Court to officially change his name. He changed it to Julian Jenkins. He chose to honor the family that stood by him during his lowest point, the family that took him in with piping hot food and loud, genuine laughter around a slightly crowded dining table. He completely severed his ties to the man who valued control over everything else. The legal process would take a few months for public notice and a final court decree, but the filing itself was the loudest possible statement. "I am choosing the family that actually chooses me." On April 2nd, my restaurant boss called me into her office. "Sarah, let's make this official. Executive chef and managing partner for the new location. A base salary of $120,000, plus a 15% share of net profits. You earned this, not because you made headlines in some high society drama, but because you proved to everyone just how strong your backbone is." When I walked into that so-called country club negotiation, I was just an employee making $85,000 a year. By the time I walked out of the storm as a winner, I was a partner in a premier restaurant. The people who valued me did so because they knew my integrity was priceless. On Monday, April 5th, we drove up to my parents' farm in upstate New York. The 3-bedroom wood frame bungalow looked exactly the same. The porch my dad built was a little faded, and my mom still had her kitchen spice jars arranged in the exact way she found most efficient. When my dad shook Julian's hand this time, the grip was entirely different. It was the heavy, meaningful handshake shared between men who respect each other. That respect was no longer because Julian was the heir to some massive corporation, but because he had earned it through his own actions. "Ben T," my dad said, his eyes welling up with tears. "That means everything to us." My mom threw her arms around Julian, crying tears of pure joy, before immediately making a huge fuss over my barely noticeable stomach. In typical fashion, she cooked enough food to last for 3 days. My younger brother kept joking that Julian had finally escaped into the world of regular people. We sat around that old wooden table that was a tight squeeze for 6 people, but it felt incredibly spacious. Julian looked around at the mismatched dining chairs, the loud overlap of overlapping conversations, and the unbreakable warmth that didn't require a single cent to maintain. After dinner, he pulled me out onto the porch and said in a quiet voice, "This is exactly what they tried to make me give up." I gripped his hand tightly. He will never understand it. No amount of offshore accounts can ever buy this. Wednesday, April 15th, 11 a.m. A small townhouse courthouse in upstate New York. I wore a cream-knit knee-length dress I bought at a boutique outlet for $200. Instead of hiding my 18-week baby bump, it proudly framed the curve of new life. Julian wore his familiar deep blue suit, his grandmother's emerald cufflinks catching the spring sunlight pouring through the narrow windows. The only people in the room were my dad, my mom, our lawyer Grace, my former boss, and the witnesses required by law. It was just the family who truly wanted to witness our most important milestone. The justice of the peace, a woman in her late 50s, smiled at us. Even though she had likely performed thousands of these ceremonies, her eyes were completely genuine. "By the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Julian kissed me with an intensity that made it feel like we were the only 2 people in that simple room. When we pulled apart, my dad was quietly wiping his eyes, my mom was sobbing, my brother was pretending he had something in his eye. Grace was recording it on her phone, and my boss was clapping furiously. The ceremony was small, it was noisy, but it was absolutely flawless. We had originally planned a completely different wedding. It was supposed to be a massive autumn event at the Boston Public Library with 200 high society guests, the kind of picture-perfect show meant to satisfy other people's expectations. But we canceled all of that, and this was 10,000 times better. Just 7 people, a 7-minute ceremony, and then we went out to grab the best artisanal coal-fired pizza in town. It was the exact same thing we ate on our first official date back in 2024, sitting in a similar wooden booth, talking about the essence of food, the meaning of family, and how to keep the little things pure over time. To Sarah and Julian, my dad said, raising a glass of sparkling water, since I couldn't drink and Julian refused to drink without me. To the family that actually shows up. And to you two, for reminding us that the only thing in this world more expensive than money is a line you refuse to cross. When we stepped out of that small local courthouse, we were legally husband and wife. There was no multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire, no $400 million mega merger, and no arrogant handouts from his father. It was just us, and everything that was real in that exact moment. And somehow it felt like we owned the entire world. We rented a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom brick apartment on the 2nd floor of a building in Somerville, just outside of Boston. It had old oak floors that let out a comforting creak when you stepped on them. The 2nd bedroom faced east, catching the full morning sun, absolutely perfect for a nursery. We signed the lease on April 20th. On the day we moved in, I stood in that empty nursery, already picturing it in my head. Walls painted a soft, warm oatmeal color, a white wooden crib, and a vintage rocking chair in the corner. The very one my mother used when I was a baby, which she had specially shipped down from her farm. It was a community we chose for ourselves, an old apartment completely detached from Vance Pharmaceuticals, family inheritances, or any class concepts tied to wealth. There were no labels here, except for the bond we were building with our own 2 hands. "Should we go with a light yellow?" Julian asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind and gently resting his hands on my stomach. "I'm thinking oatmeal. Something warm feels right." We were starting over. Not because we had been backed into a corner with nowhere else to go, but because it was our own choice. Every single decision made in this space now belonged entirely to the people who were actually going to live in it, not some dictator hiding behind the scenes trying to remote control everyone else's destiny. Richard made one last attempt to reach out. In early May, he called the direct line at Julian's office. The assistant asked if Julian wanted to take it. "Tell him I'm in a meeting," Julian said without even looking up. He wasn't in a meeting. He was sitting at his desk, doing the heavy lifting of restructuring the company's compliance department from the ground up after the dust settled. At 33 years old, he was working tirelessly to clean up a massive mess, striving to steer Vance Pharmaceuticals back to the original vision of his grandfather, to cure illnesses and save lives, rather than serving as a laundering machine for corporate capital. The message in that final refused call was unmistakable. There was nothing left for us to talk about. Julian started seeing a therapist twice a week, specializing in family trauma. He was processing a complex kind of grief, mourning a father who was still physically alive but entirely gone in spirit, mourning the supportive father figure he had always imagined having but who never actually existed, and learning to separate those 2 very distinct feelings of loss. "I keep waiting to feel some sort of guilt," Julian told me after a session in late April, "because I'm the one who exposed him. I'm the one who ended his empire, but I don't feel guilty at all. I just feel incredibly relieved. Is that normal?" "Yes," I said. "You're grieving the father you should have had, not the tyrant you actually got. Those are 2 completely different things. Some fathers are chosen, and some are just bad luck." Julian was finally learning to accept that distinction. On a Sunday evening in May, we were organizing the last few cardboard boxes in our Somerville apartment. Boxes labeled kitchen, textbooks, and work documents were stacked neatly against the wall. There was a charming kind of energy in the slight chaos of moving in. In a corner, I found the original wedding planning binder we had put together back in the fall of 2025. Venue deposit receipts, tentative guest lists, sketches of high-end floral arrangements, all designed to satisfy Richard's need for prestige, and all the things I had personally canceled when playing my part in our calculated separation. Right beside it, Julian discovered a much thinner folder. Written on the front was, "The Real Wedding, April 2026. Inside was our marriage certificate from the local courthouse, the receipt from the brick oven pizza place where we celebrated, and a slightly blurry photo Grace had snapped right as the judge declared us husband and wife. "Which one do you think is better?" Julian asked, holding up both folders. I smiled, resting my hand on my stomach. 20 weeks. I could already feel distinct movements. They were real, strong little kicks, proof that this tiny life was growing vibrant and healthy. And he belonged entirely, completely to us. The one where we chose each other without a single doubt, I said, even if it meant losing what they called everything, especially that. He pulled me into his arms, careful not to press against my stomach, and splayed his wide palm gently over it, as if he could shield this child from any storm with that touch alone. We're building something that's completely ours now, he said. Our own home, our own way, on our own foundation. Here's the thing you have to understand about foundations. Some are inherited, and some are built by hand. An inherited foundation always comes with a heavy history, suffocating expectations, and sometimes deep structural cracks that you didn't cause but are forced to repair. But a foundation you build yourself is dug out from the flat ground, inch by inch. You personally choose every beam, every support point, and every single stone that locks the structure together. Building your own foundation is much harder, and it takes far more time. It requires you to be completely clear about exactly what you are building and why. But that kind of foundation belongs genuinely to you, and it is absolutely unbreakable. I looked around the apartment, still cluttered with boxes, thinking about the new life we were starting in a neighborhood where no one had even heard the name Richard Vance. I looked at this old building that would never bear a corporate logo, and the future we were constructing brick by brick, entirely safe from anyone who thought they could manipulate it with money. Some foundations are inherited, I whispered, and some you build yourself. Julian kissed my forehead. We're building. 4 months later, we welcomed a healthy baby boy. We named him Adam Jenkins, after my father, and using my last name, honoring the ordinary, incredible people who step up and offer unconditional love when things fall apart. We're going to raise him right here in this Somerville apartment with the beautiful morning light. We'll teach him that integrity doesn't carry a price tag and that real family can't be faked. There are things in this life with a value far greater than any wealth tucked inside a manila envelope or a non-disclosure agreement. He will never meet his grandfather, Richard. That is a choice we made, an absolute boundary we drew, and the only way to protect the home we worked so hard to build from the man who tried to tear it out by the roots. The story might circulate on social media for a little while. People will screenshot the Globe articles, break down the Vance Pharmaceuticals financial fraud cases on forums, or make short videos gossiping about the chef who walked away from a massive estate and a promissory note. People are always going to have their opinions. Some will say I was foolish and should have just taken the money in the house. Some will call Julian ungrateful for turning on the father who gave him a life of luxury, and others will laugh at us for being naive enough to think love can stand up to that level of corporate power. Let them think whatever they want. We know the truth, and the truth is this. On December 16, 2025, a man who thought he was God tried to use a mere $500,000 to erase me from his son's life completely. I refused. He maliciously fabricated evidence, trying to frame me as an opportunistic fraud, and my fiancé took exactly 6 seconds to see right through that lie. Then, we moved together. With absolute precision, we documented every single crime his father committed: fraud, money laundering, data falsification, intentional framing, and using a marriage as a pawn for an illegal acquisition. At the absolute peak of that dirty deal, right in front of every heavyweight witness, we let the truth detonate. A $400 million merger vanished into thin air. A corrupt CEO was stripped of his power and removed from his empire in complete disgrace. And 2 young people went to a modest town courthouse, stood before 7 people who truly cared about them, and became husband and wife. The love and loyalty inside that simple room carried far more weight than any lavish gala they had ever thrown. 8 months later, they had a son. This child is going to grow up with absolute clarity, knowing there are things in this world that money can never buy, and the people who think they can buy someone's soul and boundaries will always end up losing everything in the end. That is our story. That is the foundation we laid, and what we are building is going to last. If you've ever been told that you aren't good enough, or that you don't belong, if anyone has ever calculated your net worth and discarded you, if someone has tried to use financial power to force you to abandon the future you chose, If you have ever stood in a room filled with money, power, and arrogance, and said a definitive no, simply because you knew your soul was worth far more than any price they could offer, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you refuse to sell. Tell me about the foundation you are building. Because the stories this world truly needs to hear aren't about the people who inherited empires with a silver spoon. They are about the people who stood in the ruins with nothing but resilience and integrity and built a better fortress from scratch. They are about the people who, when faced with immense wealth, chose humanity instead. They are about the people who refused to bend their backs, no matter the cost. That's my story. What's yours?